Oh hey, welcome back. Whether you love or hate the concept of relic guitars, it's pretty hard to deny that the new Fender Vintera II Road Worn series look pretty sweet, right? I, for one, am all for Road Worn guitars, and in fact, I'm currently in the middle of building my own early 60s replica Jazzmaster. This new release has me kind of questioning whether it's even worth it. I'm going for a 61 spec, and the new Vintera II Road Worn Jazzmaster is kind of a 58, 59 spec, but they just look so good. I'm really struggling not having second thoughts. Fender's history of producing relic guitars goes back to J.W. Black and Vince Canetto's introduction of the concept to the Fender Custom Shop back in the 90s. However, Fender introduced the Mexican Road Worn series in the 2000s as a distinct line, promising an affordable and mass-produced alternative to those top-tier instruments. As there's been lots of changes to this line over the years, I thought it would be cool to do a quick overview, and in the process to highlight a couple of things that really stand out about the new Vintera II models. When I think of early mass-produced relic guitars, I can't help but think of the Fender Mexico Joe Strummer Telecaster and the Vintage brand of guitars. While the Joe Strummer is actually a more recent model, I think it really exemplifies that early era of relic guitars perfectly. Back in the early 2000s, when mass-produced relic guitars were first a thing, the aging was always so uniform and so unnatural and so obviously artificial. All of the wear marks were just stencils or even transfers applied over the top of the guitar's finish, but before the clear coat was applied. It produced these big, high contrast, cartoonish blobs on an instrument which otherwise felt brand new. It's safe to say that attempting to replicate nitrocellulose wear marks on a poly finish really didn't work. However, it was a new thing, and vintage guitars here in the UK really popularised the concept. I remember the wear on the back of the headstock and on the back of the neck of my vintage V100 MR PGM model being particularly strange. It used a stencil on the back of the neck to try and make it look really worn in, even down to the bare wood in some places. But it all featured the same thick polyurethane finish across the whole neck. It was just splodges of different colour to try and replicate different amounts of wear. It was so unnatural and so clearly just an aesthetic, and otherwise felt completely uniform and like a brand new guitar. I know that the Fender Joe Strummer Telecaster is already replicating a finish that was very DIY in the first place, but it definitely shares that cartoonish stencil vibe. It was therefore such a big deal when Fender introduced the original Road Worn series back in 2009. Finally, a more authentic attempt at natural aging, combining a worn-in feel with a more realistic look. Rather than using polyurethane stencils or even transfers, these finally had actual nitrocellulose finishes that had been actually physically aged. This was such a departure from those cartoony stencils, and it caused such a stir at the time. The wear was still very uniform and not wholly believable, but they represented an enormous leap forward in the production of mass-produced relic guitars. There were two Strats, a Tele, a jazz bass, and a P bass. But did you ever play one of those? My goodness, yeah, they looked cool, but they didn't feel nice. My recollection of playing one is that it felt so crusty. The pickup selector and the knobs were all so tarnished and rusty, and the finish on the body and the back of the neck was weirdly rough as well. It wasn't at all like the worn-in, smooth, aged nitrocellulose finish of an actually old guitar. They were also kind of matte, which isn't super realistic when compared with actual vintage instruments. Fender revised this a little bit with the Road Worn Player series released in 2011. These were essentially the same as the original Road Worn series, but with more modern necks and hot-rodded pickups. Fender took on feedback from players and customers, and they toned down the relic work a little bit and they stopped putting that super rusty tarnished finish on the bridges, knobs and machine heads. But the relic finish with those hot rodded specs was kind of a weird combination. The finishes were smoothed out a lot to make them feel much nicer under the hand, but this also gave them a much more matte appearance. The relic work was still pretty uniform, and combined with that super matte appearance, it kind of made that relic work, even though it was physically aged nitro, look more like that older generation of transfers and stencils. The Road Worn Player series got a much less enthusiastic reception than the original Road Worn series, and there still weren't any offset guitars in the lineup either, which is the special interest of this channel. They stuck with 2 Strats and 1 Tele. No basses here either. That all changed in 2015 when Fender introduced the Classic Series 60s Road Worn models, finally including both a Jazzmaster and a Jaguar. These were a much more subtle attempt at a relic job than either of the previous 2 series. These weren't strictly vintage spec like the original 2009 series, but they weren't modern spec either like the 2011 Player series. They were kind of halfway in between, definitely vintage inspired, and they had that much more realistic paint job. The wear mark still felt a little bit uniform, but it was far less obnoxious than previous attempts, and was much more focused on dings and a worn-in feel than wholesale destruction. However, they did feature a thick poly undercoat and relatively cheap pickups and electronics for the price of the instruments. Criticism was still levied against the relative dullness of the finishes on these models, but they were a significant improvement over the previous Road Worn Player series, and they were definitely a move in the right direction. A quick editorial note, I'm just editing the video early in the morning before work. This is Audrey. She doesn't normally join me for videos because she's got a really sniffly nose at all times, but it's quiet at the moment. One really important factor about the Fender Classic Series 60s Road Worn models is that the necks were completely finished in polyurethane. There was no nitrocellulose on the neck or headstock of those models at all. So you had a really thick poly undercoat on the body with nitro on top, and then the neck was completely polyurethane finished. So this was a massive departure when compared with the original Road Worn series and the Road Worn Player series, which had nitro over the whole body. So although there were some definite improvements and some really positive things about the Classic Series 60s Road Worn models, the fact that the neck was completely polyurethane was a massive departure, and again, of course, a cause for a lot of complaints. Then, in 2020, Fender released the Vintera Road Worn 50s, 60s and 70s models. We were again stripped of any offset models, but we did get a Telecaster Deluxe, which was pretty sweet. And these were released more or less in tandem with the Fender Brad Paisley Road Worn Telecaster model. I have to say, I thought the 50s Road Worn Lake Placid Blue Telecaster and the silver sparkle colour of the Brad Paisley Telecaster were especially nice. The relic on the Brad Paisley Telecaster went back to that super exaggerated forearm wear on the bout just here, which isn't especially believable. But by and large, the non-signature models collected a much more subtle collection of dings across the body and much more believable fretboard wear as well. Not this super exaggerated and distinct style that I have here. Of course, there were still things to complain about, and probably most notably was the lack of rosewood fretboards on the 60s models. Instead, as was common in this era of Fender, featuring Pal Ferro fretboards instead. They also didn't necessarily come in the most desirable or authentic colours for the period as well, and not to mention the fact of the ongoing criticism of the style of the relic job. Even though it was much more subtle than ever before, and perhaps much more realistic, it still didn't have the same attention to detail or quality as a real vintage instrument that had naturally worn over time, or of a custom shop instrument. Particularly the specific luster that a vintage nitro clear coat acquires, as well as that iconic lacquer checking. Some people even went as far as to suggest that, with the exception of the new colours, nothing had really changed about these models in a meaningful way since the introduction of the guitars back in 2009. Well, given that Fender has released a new Road Worn series just about every 5 years since 2009, if you were paying attention, you should have been expecting a new Road Worn series to be released around 2025, and Fender haven't disappointed. I have to say, based on all of the photos and video I've seen so far, the new Vintera II Road Worn series look so authentic. Gone is that high contrast caricature blob work and the over-the-top sanding. It's been replaced with beautifully natural looking checking and authentic neckwear. If you compare the aging on the back of the neck of the Vintera II Road Worn Jazzmaster with Mike Adams' own 1961 Jazzmaster pancake, you can see that the relicking work they've done here is incredibly authentic looking. And it's the same story with the checking on the headstock and all over the bodies of these guitars as well. This kind of finish wear was previously only available from Fender at the very highest price point, i.e. the Fender Custom Shop. Yet the Fender Custom Shop have a really bad habit of going for really over-the-top, overkill, unrealistic relicking on the back of all the guitar necks. Just like this, where all of the lacquer is removed between the 1st fret and about the 12th fret. In my opinion, this is just as unnatural and just as inauthentic as those early relic jobs with those poly, blobby, patchy stencils that brands like Vintage used to use. It really isn't what a vintage guitar would look like at all, even one that's seen really heavy usage like Mike Adams' pancake. Fender Mexico is really taking on the Fender Custom Shop with this latest line of Road Worn guitars, and even the beautiful work of small independent finish workers like Golden Age Guitars in Northern Ireland. The Vintera II Road Worn series isn't just an improvement for Fender Mexico, it's an improvement for Fender, full stop. Aside from this new, super realistic, vintage style aging on the Vintera II Road Worn series, the other thing that fascinates me is that they're coming with the new Fender patent pending Vibrato as well that we've seen on the leaked photos of the American Professional Classic series. This is really cool because a proper 58 or 59 vintage Jazzmaster would have a vibrato that says pat penned on the plate here rather than the patent number that you get on a modern unit like the AVRI. So the fact it has a patent pending vibrato on it, on top of the really authentic aging and the period correct anodized pickguard, all these little details really make it a really compelling vintage style instrument. However, there isn't any information on Fender's website whatsoever about this new vibrato they're using. This is kind of weird, and you'd expect that if they had recreated that mythical vintage unit, that they'd be shouting about it and boasting about it all over the product page and their social media accounts. But they're absolutely silent about this new vibrato they've introduced. If you're not familiar with the Fender patent pending vibrato, it's the mythical and legendary vibrato used on vintage Fender Jazzmasters from 1958 to 1962. It features a shorter, fatter carbon steel spring, and many players report them to have a magical feel, and they're the favoured units of offset legends such as Mike Adams. It's also exactly what I'm trying to replicate with the vibrato I'm putting together for my own 61 Jazzmaster build. If you want to know more about what makes the patent pending vibrato different and my attempts to recreate one of these mythical units, then check out the video up here to find out more. It would be super interesting to get my hands on one of these vibratos and take it apart and see whether it's just the old classic player or made in Mexico vibrato inside, or whether they really have done something to try and recreate the feel and the specification of those early mythical units. You'd think that if they had done that, they would have at least said something about it. Almost every aspect of the new Vintera Road Worn Jazzmaster is everything that I'm looking for in a vintage style Jazzmaster, and the whole reason why I'm building one of my own in the first place, because there wasn't one available that met all of those requirements. And I really can't help thinking now, have I made the wrong decision? What do you think? Do you think I should just sack in this whole DIY vintage project that I'm building myself all together and just quickly put up the funds to buy the Vintera II Road Worn Jazzmaster? Or do you think maybe there's something in building one from scratch yourself? If you haven't seen the couple of videos I've published already about the build process and what I'm aiming for and what I'm using, you can check that out here. The one thing I was disappointed in about the release of this new guitar is that Fender didn't send one to my buddy Eddie over at Totally Wired Guitars. I feel like a review from Eddie really would have complemented the videos published by Emily at Get Offset, by Ryan at 60 Cycle Hum, and by Che at Lounging Guitars. Not that those videos were particularly lacking anything, but I really think Eddie would have complemented those beautifully. I hope he'll be able to get his hands on one and share his thoughts with us on it in due course. So, there you go. This guitar has definitely given me a lot of food for thought. I have to say, I think it looks sick. And for just 1,300 quid, it kind of seems like a no-brainer. Alright, well, that's it for today. It was just a relatively quick video for me this week. My band has been in the studio this weekend tracking vocals for a new single that we're hoping to have out by the end of the year. And so that's taken up most of my free time this weekend, so I've had very little time or energy for putting a video together. But I hope you've enjoyed this little look. It's obviously no playing in this one and hopefully a shorter overall product than what I normally do. But I thought it would be really fun and on topic to have a look at Fender's Road Worn models over the years. If you enjoy videos about Jaguars, Jazzmasters or Mustangs, and especially if you like new or unusual hardware upgrades, then please do like this video and subscribe to the channel for plenty more to come. Alright then, well until next time, take it easy, look after yourselves, and we'll see each other again soon.